Welcome to the Christian Saints Podcast, a joint production of Paradosis Pavilion and Generative Sounds. On this program, we look to the lives of the saints, as well as the structure of the liturgical calendar, to be our guides on the journey of the way of the life of faithfulness to the evengalion of Jesus, the Christ, a journey toward virtue and salvation. Your hosts are Father Simeon Keys, a priest assigned to St. Raphael Antiochian Orthodox Church in Iowa City, and James John Marks, a layman in the Orthodox Church, as well as a composer and producer living in Chicago. Here's today's episode. A quick apology. The audio quality and some of the video quality of this episode are not of our usual caliber. There was apparently a bit of a technical issue when we recorded the episode, and there is nothing we can do about it in post-production. We appreciate your patience. Here's the episode. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, God is one. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. In the name of the Lord, Father, please give the blessing.
God is with us through his divine grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, and unto ages of ages.
Amen. Hi, Father. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Welcome back, everybody. This recording, we are going to encourage you to lose control. In the wake of our recent conversation with Nick, the first part of which, at the time of this recording, should be available for all of you to see, we talked a fair bit about the Tower of Babel as it related to the event of Pentecost in the second chapter of Acts. And that got Father Simeon and I to thinking more about the Tower of Babel as this symbol of humanity trying to be the master of its own destiny. And to some extent, or at least one of the points of the story, there are of course many, but one of the points of the story was God sort of letting humanity know, no, you're not in control of your own destiny. I am in control of everything. And much of the rest of the Bible is people not necessarily learning that lesson very quickly and having to be reminded repeatedly. So, hence our humorous title. A big part of the way of the life of faithfulness is coming to realize we don't have the control we think we have over our life. And primarily the reason people want that is we're afraid of death. And so if we can accept that Jesus has conquered death, we don't need to be afraid of death. We don't need to be afraid that we're not in control. We can trust God to be in control. And so that's kind of the premise for what we're going to talk about today. Things are a little open-ended here. We have some notes. We have some things we might want to bring up. But we've talked the last several episodes about the two competing civil religions in the United States, which both claim this mastery of our destiny, all of which stems back to the Enlightenment, which was this idea that humanity over time would evolve to a place where our mastery of reason and of logic and of insight into the world would do away with all superstition, would do away with all error. People would unite together under a common banner and move forward as one humanity, which sounds a little bit like the Tower of Babel when you stop to think about it. So this is sort of the framework that we're going to talk in, and I'm going to kick things over to Father Simeon right away and let him say something more wise than I could to get us started.
Well, no pressure.
It's a low bar, don't worry.
Yeah, I think about this. I think about this a lot, and I think the reason I'm thinking about it so much right now, perhaps, is that living in a college town, we are seeing our college town transformed by the return of students right now. And as I like to say always, we have two competing ideological civil religions in our country, one being what you might consider more of a traditional civil religion, more continuity with American history. And that is one in which you hear about Judeo-Christian values, whatever that means. Talk about God. There's the display of the Ten Commandments. Sometimes I'm talking about the United States as though it were intended to be a theocracy. There's a lot of different features of that, and one that's really is expressed through today neoconservative politics, and that's certainly a civil religion. If you go underneath the politics, we think we're discussing politics sometimes in our country, but underlying that is this social ideology. And that's true on the right, and it is true on the left. If we go to the left, we see beyond what you might consider classical liberal politics, progressive politics, what you might call woke politics. Underlying that is a particular ideology. And I deal with that mostly because that really is the dominant ideology, I would say, for most people in our country. Certainly it's true in educational institutions, in secular educational institutions. That is certainly in my particular context, there's no doubt, the dominant ideology. And interestingly, I can think of a couple places in the United States that's very much like this one, in which you have a city in which you have one dominant ideology, and you go a few minutes outside of the city into the rural areas and you get the other one. So there's tension between the two.
And one place that might surprise people in regard to that, I lived for a long time in New England. I lived in and around Boston. I lived in and around Providence. And people tend to think of New England as a whole as this kind of the bastion of American liberalism. And certainly in the cities, that is certainly true. But I think even to the surprise of a lot of people, you don't have to go too far out into the rural parts of New England to meet people with a very different perspective on the world than those of Boston or Providence. So even in a place like that we tend to think of as being all blue, it's really not.
I've seen it in more the East, Northeast, the South, the Midwest. I mean, I have friends in California, which, depending on where you are in California, it's a very different place. And I want to mention that I was in Chicago recently, and I took a picture because I was on a boat in the river and happened to be in front of a Trump Tower, and I was trying to get a picture of me and skyscrapers so we could use it as part of the podcast. And we went past the Trump Tower and I took a picture. And I kept thinking when I posted it, people may wonder, like, is this pro-President Trump policies or anti-President Trump policies? And the answer to that is neither, because it really is about I'm taking pictures of skyscrapers. For those of us who especially remember Trump before politics, it was a brand, right? And it's all about wealth. It's about opulence. It's about I'm going to do what I can do and I can achieve incredible things. And you could be like me, buy my stuff. It's sort of the American thing, monetizing success. And so that's really what it's about.
And I went ahead and made that even more ambiguous by using it for the show. And for the short video that I put up on YouTube with that photograph of you under the Trump sign, I labeled it "Orthodoxy crushes all of that," which just makes it even more ambiguous as to which way we mean it, right? Because you did actually utter that phrase. On the whole, we try not to go for this really blatant clickbait. But since you actually said it in the episode, I felt I could use it and get away with it. So, and that's proven to be a relatively popular video as our videos go. So, success on that front, I guess. Welcome, new viewers.
And I'll say this also about being Orthodox in politics. Being Orthodox and dealing with the political realm is relatively simple and straightforward. We deal with complicated issues in America, in whatever country you're in. The issues are often complicated. And what I mean complicated, fixing the issues are complicated. Dealing with law and mercy sometimes is complicated. How do you enforce law and yet do such in a merciful sort of way, right? Justice and mercy. Those should always be held together. They're not contradictions. But sometimes we are faced with a simple decision, and that is we have candidate A and candidate B, And as Orthodox Christians, we look at candidate A and candidate B, and we try to discern, as though we could trust politicians, what their positions are. And different individuals have different particular emphases on positions. For example, having children education for me is a big deal. What does a candidate want to do with education? For other people, it may be something else depending on their stage in life or where they live. If you're a farmer, you're going to be very interested in what's going to happen in the farming industry. If you're a factory worker, what's going to happen with American jobs and factories. But we look at those things and we weigh them differently, and we choose a candidate that we think is the best. And our culture, the problem is because underlying the extremes of political choices and political ideas, we have these ideological religions. If we don't have a true religion, what we end up doing is those become our religions, right? And that informs us about what is not just the best candidate or not. Our religious view tells us what is good and evil. Is because we really go beyond the surface and we start asking questions about, we can even go deeper into, where did human beings come from? What is the meaning of life? Why do we exist? What does it mean to be a man or a woman? What is marriage? What is a healthy relationship look like? What does a human being who is completely healthy in a holistic sort of way look like? What is spirituality? How do we treat other people? What's our relationship to our neighbor? What's our relationship to our enemies? But what is our relationship to the world? What is good and evil again? What is truth? Does truth exist? If you go deep, you find that there are answers to these questions. And I like to say on one side, we have an ideology that sometimes pretends to be Christianity and will draw some of these answers from some form of Christianity, often a post-16th century German form of Christianity. So you might, maybe not correctly interpreted, but still we draw from the biblical text in some ways. And then the other side often really is opposed to Christianity, vocally sometimes, and certainly would not use a religious text to come up with these answers. Some might try to answer it scientifically. Often it'll be just answered socially. What the society dominantly says on that end of the spectrum is what people choose to believe.
Or in the name of science, without any actual science behind what's being said. There's a presumption of science. Because I have modern ideas, they must be rooted in science, even if I can't point to any verified studies that back me up.
Yeah, and part of this has to do with a vision of reality in which, on one end, you can really have a vision of reality where what you see is what you get. There's only the material world. There is no spiritual reality. And this is very interesting to me. I really like using the word woke religion. And I have really thought a lot about this because, woke and progressive are very much political terms. Woke is particularly used these days in a pejorative sort of way. But if we really think about it, I like using the sense of progressive spirituality, because what does it mean? It's sort of this idea of humanity evolving positively in some way, that we are so much better now than we were. We understand the reality so much more than we did. And the sense of woke is really the sense of being awake. It's really a sense of enlightenment. kind of a secular enlightenment.
I was going to say, in some ways, it's the best of classical liberalism, which goes back to the Enlightenment.
And the word was used to be, aware of discrimination, to be aware of bad things. It's really, right, the intent in the use of that particular word. So I like using that word. But if we go underneath of this, what do we really see? And there really is no spirituality. And what I mean by that is often, and again, I'm speaking very generally, some people would say, yeah, I believe in a spiritual realm. Yeah, and there is a spiritual realm. And I will say this, that when you deal with spirituality, everybody has some experience with the spiritual realm. Even if you deny the spiritual realm, you are having an experience. It's not a very good experience because it's a very thin knowledge. There is a personal sense to the spiritual realm, but people don't experience that. The spirituality is spoken of in very non-specific terms. Oftentimes, people use the term energy. We use the term energy too, but for us, energy is personal. There's something, ultimately, there's nothing higher than person, actually. We could talk about that.
There is one who is acting as opposed to woo, woo, woo energy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. There's no, outside of this, though, if we look at this, energy is spoken about, or even divinity in a very impersonal sort of way, like there's just the sea of divinity out there that we can kind of connect to. But really, practically, I see that when we talk about spirituality in a secular realm, it really is just psychological wellness, if I can use the term wellness, or emotional wellness. It's not even spirituality. And part of that is a misunderstanding of anthropology that has really been lost to the whole West. It's true if we go to the right or the left politically and go down into those religions, there's not a real understanding of the heart. And that's why most of the time when left and right debate politically, or even real debate underlying ideology, it's philosophical debating. And because our rationality is part of our spiritual life, but there's nothing more there for some people. Right.
I think a huge part of that is an overemphasis on psychology. We live in a very psychologized culture. And to some extent, this was the joke we were making when we were talking about Jesus not being a hippie. We don't see a lot of psychology in scripture. We don't see a lot of psychology in the words of Jesus himself. He wasn't particularly concerned with people's feelings,
right,
particularly concerned with their thoughts, not in the sense that our thoughts can't have a morality, because of course they do, but in their thoughts, in terms of their thoughts being more real than what they do as a person. And there's this phenomenon now in our culture of people saying, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And mostly what they mean by that is, I have a set of feelings that I cherish, but I don't tie those to anything that I do. And interestingly, we're seeing more and more of this creep into certain kinds of American Christian traditions, where you see more and more people who want to say things like, well, I'm a follower of Jesus, but I'm not a Christian, or I'm a follower of Jesus, but I don't go to a particular church. And we also see this in this very strange, incompatible tendencies in our culture that are kind of a new form of Gnosticism, where on the one hand, cremation is on the rise more and more and more because we don't value the body over these feelings and emotions and psychology that we have. But on the flip side, everyone is completely obsessed with optimizing their physical health because they don't want to die. And so there's this fear of death. It's where we started. There's the fear of death that drives this mania around physical health, while at the same time, people are effectively being Gnostics because what they really care about are their own thoughts, not their physical being and what their physical being does in the world. And there are certain ideological movements in our culture that have taken this to quite an extreme, where there are people who they think they are in their head is more real than what their body says they are as a person. And we've created an entire movement out of that. And we're not here to get into that debate. But where I find that interesting and useful for our discussion is the way of the life of faithfulness is the stuff you do. not the thoughts in your head. And there's quite a lot from the saints that tell us, like, okay, you don't feel like you love your neighbor. That's fine. Treat your neighbor with love, and eventually you will feel like you love them. Start with the doing, and your thoughts will come around later. And that's okay. But if you try to think about it until you do it, you'll never do it.
It bears repeating, everyone is religious and everyone is spiritual in a sense. And what I mean by that is everyone, if you start asking questions, everyone has a worldview. And what I mean by that is just this underlying set of assumptions about reality, and they live according to that. And these are really, again, ultimate questions. Does God exist? Who is God? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What are relationships? What are our relationship to different people and different things? All of these things. And we are spiritual in the sense that we are spiritual beings, whether we acknowledge it or not. And this is the problem, is that, for example, at a university, if a university is trying to help people mentally, physically, and spiritually with wellness, they can't help you spiritually with wellness. They can help you with your psychological state a little bit through maybe counseling, and maybe your emotional state, help you feel better about yourself. What they have to do with spirituality sometimes is try to farm you out to whatever, quote unquote, a religious or spiritual tradition you come from. But if those are not correct, then that's not going to help you either. At least sometimes they acknowledge that they don't have a way of doing that. So at least they send people to other places. And there are things that are really psychological, emotional, and physical, sort of like yoga or Tai Chi or something. And I'm a fan of Tai Chi, but I'm always explaining there's nothing spiritual really about Tai Chi. And American yoga, there's nothing spiritual really about it either. So people, just by integrating some kind of movement to their body while they're engaging in essentially psychological and emotional experiences, if you're like sitting and meditating with your body, watching a sunrise, that's not spiritual. It'll make you feel good. I mean, there is a reason that connecting to nature does something to us. Just like there is a reason that we sometimes have an inclination to loving our neighbor. And that is because we really aren't spiritual beings. But what we think spirituality is not spirituality. It's something much, much deeper than that.
In some ways, American yoga, and thank God what most people are doing is American yoga and not real yoga, because our world would be getting a lot worse if it was the other way around. But that aside, American yoga, I think to some extent comes from the same underlying cultural assumptions that certain varieties of very modern Protestant Christianity come from. These services that are, again, about sort of a very particular experience that's largely an emotional experience. You might get some education in the middle, but all the music at the beginning and all the music at the end is very much geared toward feeling a certain way. And we now think of that as worship rather than the participating in the once for all sacrifice of the Eucharist as worship. And so in some ways, I think this phenomenon of American yoga comes from the same underlying impulses of, I want to give import and weight and meaning to my feelings because I'm being raised in a culture that doesn't give weight or meaning to anything else.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mentioned some things people do with the bodies and try to integrate that into spirituality. But you're right also that we do live in this Gnostic age where we are so close, we are so focused on our emotional state along with our psychological state. I often think it's spirituality. And yet, the body is not really part of that spiritual life in a lot of ways. And, for example, I mean, in the Orthodox Church, we are always involving our bodies in our spiritual life. It has to do with what we eat and when we eat and when we don't eat. And it has to do with things like lighting a candle, or bowing down, or making a prostration, or taking ourselves into a physical church temple, whether we feel like it or not, at 9 a.m. Actually, our spiritual life determining what we do with our bodies. Our physical life is determined by our spiritual life. And then in doing that, we make our physical bodies become part of the therapy of our souls. And we don't really see that dominantly in our culture. And there really is often a split that people aren't aware of. They don't really think that what they do with their body really affects their spirituality. I can be spiritual, which means, again, mostly certain psychological thoughts and having certain emotional feelings. As long as I have those, and what I do with my body really doesn't matter.
And on the other extreme, we see a version of the same thing. The people who are still clinging to the age of reason, the people who are still clinging to modernism, who are ardent materialists, who preach sciencism, also basically live in their heads. Mm-hmm. They think what they're doing is logic and reason and science, but in some ways it's still psychology, and in some ways it's still feelings. They've just convinced themselves that what they're doing is more rational than the person out in the woods doing yoga. But it's all still, it has nothing to do with what they do. It has everything to do with what they think. It's all in their head. And so in some ways it's the same.
This is my story. I mean, in some ways, right? I think this is a problem with Christianity in the West as it developed, is that it became a rational philosophical ideology in a lot of ways. And I remember that there was a time when if I wanted to be more spiritual, what would I do? Or I should put it this way. If I felt that I had a deficiency in my spiritual life, and notice I said I felt that I had some deficiency in my spiritual life, what would I do? I would go maybe buy an inspirational book on spirituality and read it. And if it made me felt better, inspired me in some way, that was it, right? And often in the West, what we do, and this can be true whether you think you're religious or you don't realize you're religious, and that is we often read or watch videos, consume some kind of information, and that consuming that information makes us feel a certain way, and it will reinforce in our mind sometimes our thinking. Sometimes it may change our thinking. We're like, I have this light bulb that has come on. I've changed my thought. Therefore, I've had sort of like change in my life. Or we just read things that reinforce what we already believe and just kind of dig in. If we don't believe the right things, that's a problem, because we just become more stubborn in our ignorance. And we think that's it. That's enough. For many of us that find the ancient Eastern Orthodox faith, we realize that adding concepts to our rational set of things that we know, that doesn't spiritually change us.
And this is a huge... sorry, go ahead.
A concept of God is not God. Right? We confuse, and I knew somebody whose conversion, we both know someone whose conversion experience was about being a philosophy professor and coming to this realization that philosophy, which in the West, theology just became philosophy, can lead you to a concept of God and not to an experience of God. And that the only way to experience God is through this change of recognizing who we really are, accepting that, repenting, turning away from who who we are in order to embrace a life that is rooted in the one who can make us who we can become, who can lead us into an actual experience of God. And that's a very different way of thinking. And again, being in a university town, we have really intelligent students who will come here and they'll learn a lot of things. But you can't read your way into becoming who you can be or should be as a human being, because that requires a spiritual experience and not just a psychological or emotional experience or a psychosomatic experience involving the body, but something entirely different.
Something personal, meeting a person.
Yes, and a dramatic change in who you are and being willing to change. This really brings us back to something I think that's a core question. And first of all, before I get to this question, let's look a little bit at the history of the West. If we go back into the history of the West, we can go back, let's say, to the 11th century, and we see where Rome had been part of the ancient Orthodox Church. Now Rome breaks off from the Orthodox Church and becomes really Roman Catholicism as we know it. So Rome becomes Roman Catholicism as we know it. Let's say the 11th century. It's a long process, but Rome is disconnected from the church in the East. And in the East, we still have Jerusalem and Antioch as biblical churches alongside Alexandria, Constantinople. What we see in the West happening is a rise in scholasticism. And what I mean by this, generally, because that can mean a lot of different things, is that the West experienced a loss of the understanding of the heart as the spiritual organ, and the emphasis was on the rational brain, upon the mind. So theology became philosophy. Theology in the West ceased to be about knowing God by experience as person, but knowing concepts about God. And then we see that after Catholicism, what we call Roman Catholicism, after it came into being, that only lasted 500 years. And then we get to Protestantism, the so-called Reformation, in which that really didn't help anything. And then after the advent of Protestantism, which one could argue that Roman Catholicism was really the first form of Protestantism in the West, a main form of Protestantism. But after we have all of these different factions starting in rejection of Roman Catholicism, religious wars in Europe, and people are arguing philosophically, but they're also fighting each other. And it's a case in which it's really not necessarily religious groups fighting, but people using religion sometimes to fight for other reasons. And religion and politics have always been a thing. Again, when we talk about even secular religion, again, why is it expressed in politics? We live in a political realm, and we see that with a disconnection from the spirituality in the East and the West, this chaos, so that people decide, a lot of people have died because of these religious wars. So let's try reason. Let's just try reasoning our way through these truths. And this leads in the West to revolution. And interestingly, the French Revolution I find to be underappreciated as an event that really defines the West, because we have coming out of the French Revolution things like human rights, which we look at them, seem to be sometimes ways of having a list of Christian principles without Christ. And it's the overturning of the Roman Catholic institution. And I avoid using the term church because the ancient apostolic church in the East doesn't accept it as being a church, but being separated from the church. But if France tries this experiment of having a religion based on reason, this lasts a very short time until they say, well, we need at least a supreme being. But again, this is rather sort of non-specific sort of religion. And well, that falls apart. And the guillotine is involved in all of this as well. We see, not surprisingly, the rise of conflict. So, and then, we have, with this age of enlightenment in the West, I mean, we end up having eventually, in some ways, a continuation of the age of enlightenment. In some ways, a rejection of the age of enlightenment and a rejection of absolute truth. And that's really what's important with the West as it is today, is that a lot of what we hear about what you must believe, if you are a loving person and you are a good person, then you must believe these set of truths. But the truth is, there is no absolute truth in this ideology. And we see truth changing constantly. And in order to determine truth, who determines it? Well, really, your community determines it, right? It's sort of like everything's a social construct. But you want to demand that other people believe it. So what you have to do is you have these set of truths and you say, well, I'm oppressed because I have these truths. And we have this triangle, this hierarchy. So, we end up trying to turn over the triangle so that I can have power. Because when I have power, then I can make sure that my truths are dominant and your truths are not dominant. So there's a lot of emphasis on trying to go into power structures and institutions and trying to gain power, which you don't really think that it just makes the oppressed the oppressor. And we do all of this.
Well, the French gave us a new trinity because they gave us liberty, fraternity, and egalite. And that's the new God. And the problem with that is you can't make that God and have egalite at the same time. Because if that's God, there's a hierarchy. And the whole point of egalite is there is no hierarchy, which is why the triangle keeps rotating. Because every time you rotate it, you go, oh no, there's something at the top, we have to turn it again. Because what they really wanted is for it to be a flat rectangle, but it can't be.
Well, out of the West also, we have this other sort of conflict-based, essentially religion, in which there is a constant conflict, right? And that conflict can be between class. That conflict later is seen between race, but there's never peace. It's a constant conflict. So we're really defined by conflict. There are people up here and people down here, and the people down here have to bring the people up there down and then kind of go up at least high enough where they can enforce it. Or you just have mob rule where we'll just get enough people together where if you say what we don't like, then we'll go and protest and try to get you canceled, try to get you fired in order to enforce our vision of truth. So, and I say all of this really to get to this. We really have this religion that's dominant in America, at least among some, one of the two competing. And the question is, who are the gods of this age? Who are the gods in this American social religion? And we can say the demons. I mean, really, behind it all, if you understand that, again, if you don't believe in a spiritual realm, it's still there. And this has been pointed out. Other people have pointed this out. And we can talk a lot more about that because that really relates to Babel and to Babylon. But if we look at this religion, and really it's sort of like a paganism in the sense that not only do you have demons, but it's paganism in the sense that if someone is a Christian, they can essentially be told, listen, we don't have a problem with you being Christian. That's great. As long as you accept our ideology because that is what will make you good, right? That's what makes you loving. If you don't, then you hate.
Because love is a feeling in your head. And so your Christianity has to stay in your head. It can't come out into the world where it affects anybody other than yourself.
We've changed this, interestingly. You see a difference in language in the United States from freedom of religion to freedom of worship. Because religion is not a private thing, or it's not real. It's lived in everything that we do. You can't compartmentalize. This is also a problem with the West. We like to compartmentalize things so that you have your private life, public life, secular life, religious life. But this is not the way Christianity works rooted in the East. We live in the fullness of this life. 100% of ourselves live 100% of the faith, or we're pretending. And we don't do syncretism, which means that we will import this foreign ideology that really corrupts the wholeness of what we have, because what we have is the apostolic faith that has been passed down for 2,000 years, and that is what we're going to pass on to our kids. But it's not surprising to see that we have a lot of denominations in the United States who cannot speak truth to the world, to the society, because they have allowed themselves to be shaped by the society. It is indistinguishable. They have taken on the paganism, the secular paganism in our world. Now, some would say, well, it's not real paganism. And I know some might not like that term because it really is an insult to paganism, because paganism would have a structure of sacrifice and this sort of thing, something to bring people together. You don't see altars. Altars are part, even the thing about human religion, whether it's the true faith or a false faith run by demons, you always have altars, right? There's always an acknowledgement of something else. But this is the problem. When we look at the gods of our age, I mean, it's the demons behind it. The demons feed. What do the demons do? They feed narcissism. They feed pride. And the problem is, if we look at the religion that we can see, we don't have external gods because we've become so narcissistic that we can't conceive of anything greater than ourselves. Really, the priesthood, in some ways, are therapists and academics and life coaches or whatever, wellness experts, always telling us how great we are. And I say that, I send people to therapists if their therapy is actually alongside a spiritual life that's rooted in truth to help people overcome themselves and be who they cannot be by themselves. That's what spirituality does. So much of our work in a real spiritual life is just creating the precondition for us to experience divine power of one who is He is personal, one who is I am, not some impersonal thing out there. And that's real spirituality. But we live in this world where people kind of gather in communities and kind of have a mutual agreement that each other are gods. It's sort of this kind of pantheon. We're just a pantheon of humans, right? As somebody pointed out, I mean, if you want to really test this idea that we individually can define truth, if you slap somebody in the face and tell them, well, I just gave you a hug according to my truth, and slap, that really breaks down. I mean, we say there's no truth, but the truth is we're just create a delusion, and then we're trying to get other people to agree with our delusion so we don't feel bad. That's kind of what we do.
No one is a relativist when they go to the oncologist.
Well, that's right.
I think I could make a pretty good argument that the checkout counter of your local franchised, industrialized fast food restaurant or clothing store is an altar. I think I could make that argument, but we won't press that point too hard. I think you've said a lot here, and I think this is part of why it's so difficult to live the Orthodox life in the West, which has sort of been our unofficial theme now for quite a few weeks, is, and I've seen it in my own life, and I know you've shared that it was a struggle for you at one point, that because we're coming out of this culture where being a Christian means reading a lot of books and having a lot of thoughts, that when we come to Orthodoxy, at first there's this sense of, okay, well, now I'm just reading different books. Instead of reading the latest inspirational voice in the West around Christianity, now I'm reading St. Paisios. But at first, I'm looking for the same thing. I'm looking to feel differently about myself after I read the book. And over time, I reach a point where I realize, no, I have to read that book so that tomorrow I try to act more like St. Paisios did than I'm acting today. Or what was the point of reading the book? And this is a huge part of our struggle. We're in a culture that is so trapped in its own head. You are more of a criminal for what you think than what you do in a lot of cases in our culture, which is kind of amazing. There's a weird circle that happens, though, because we've kind of been focused on the people who live almost entirely emotionally, and that leads to a certain kind of relativism when it comes to truth. But at the same time, the people on the other side who claim to be complete materialists, if you're honest about being a rationalist and you're honest about being a materialist, the observations you can make out in the physical world, you must eventually reach a place where, if you're, again, being honest, as Nietzsche was, you must eventually reach a place where you realize it can be no truth in that framework because there can be no meaning in that framework. And so you actually reach the same place that the hippie reaches. You have to be a relativist. You can say, well, my conscience puts upon me to live life in a certain way and say that's a good life. But I can't impose that on anyone else because, frankly, I don't even know that other people exist, let alone have a position from which to tell them what to do. And so the people who are the most ardent about rationalism being the thing that's going to save us end up in the exact same place that the hippies do, if they're honest. And most of them aren't. Most of them get close to that, get afraid of it, and step back and just decide to insist that there can be meaning in a materialist frame. But if you ask them to defend that, they just get angry.
Yeah, let's talk about this. I mean, this is a continuation of this idea of us being our own gods. I mean, we idolize humanity. We idolize what we make. We've talked about this with artificial intelligence, right? If we make artificial intelligence greater than ourselves, and we think it's wiser than we are, and we follow it, we've made that. The problem with all this, how this interacts with the demons, is that the demonic realm sells the lie of self-deification, right? That we can become gods, by ourselves, on our own.
Well, that's Genesis 3.
Yes, according to pride, according to self-will and our own power.
You won't die, you'll become like God.
This is the thing about Genesis, is that we were created to be like God. And what this means for Christians, most people that do not know Orthodox Christianity will really not understand what that means. I mean, the beauty of it, and the power of it, and how great it is, how optimistic it is. When we say, for example, to be like Christ, it doesn't mean that we are nice to people as Jesus was, or that we love our neighbor, or we fulfill these commandments like societal relationship commandments that Jesus taught. It means being like Christ when he revealed who he really is on Mount Tabor, shining with his uncreated divine glory because he is God. God was leading Adam and Eve to being deified, to be like him. But what is the path? And this is the path still today of true spirituality. It's the path of the Orthodox way of life. It is humility, and it is obedience, and it is a path of truth. It's the opposite of arrogance and of self-will and of our own conception of truth that we make up, right? And that really is the problem, because let's look at this with exactly what you talked about. I mean, if you fall into the ideology of the world, if you come to believe that, this is the problem. Basically, your reality, how you understand it, is based on the fact, perhaps, that the universe doesn't really have any meaning, it just is. And if the universe just is, there's no reason it exists, there's no personal God creating it, your life has no meaning. And history really doesn't have much meaning, which is why people are always trying to convince themselves of meaning. I mean, you can delude yourself into saying, oh, my life has meaning, and come up with some philosophical reason, but you're making that up. You know, this is one of the reasons people, I think, spend so much time trying in societal change and political change, is that's all they have, right? But that's going to be overturned in the future, and we can't get away from that. There are these things that are greater than us that we can't control, right? History, we can't control that. And if we control the future, the present, the near future, I should say, we know that that could only happen for a time. I mean, history teaches us that whatever we create could be blown down pretty quickly through another revolution. The natural world that's out there, the universe, we can't do anything about that. Now, we're slaves to that. We're slaves to death. Now, we think we're gods because you can have a surgeon, for example, you can be dying, and a surgeon can do a transplant and extend your life. And what if we can go in and we can turn something biologically off and you can live longer? You can have an accident and still die. I mean, there'll probably be new diseases that will kill you anyway that we don't have cures for yet, right? And the truth is, the problem is, death is not just mortality. Right? Death is a spiritual problem, and you're just perpetuating your experience of death. It's not real life. Experiencing real life and overcoming death, you need the spiritual path for that. And that's not part of this ideology, right? And there's no meaning within this religion. Love doesn't exist. And why? Because if you have a relationship with someone and you get married to someone, what is love? It's chemicals in the brain, electrical signals. So this is the problem. Your spouse can say, I don't love you anymore. Well, how do you argue with that? First of all, when somebody says they feel a certain way, you can't argue with that. If they feel that way, they feel that way. And you just have to say, well, I mean, their chemicals in their brain change. They can't control it. So like, why not get divorced? Now we can come up with some utilitarian reason, like it would mess up our insurance or our children, you know, but this is the thing about human beings. And this has to do, again, with the spiritual life and with passions, these unnatural movements of the soul. We don't reason correctly. That's our problem. And we can use our rationality to rationalize anything we want. Anybody that does marriage counseling, they know this, right? We can say I have this set of principles. We can come up with a loophole to change those principles. Especially when love doesn't exist. Love is not this divine energy that we know it is, which is actually, get that, love is personal. Truth is personal. Truth, to put it more pointedly, truth is a person, and love is a person. And to really become loving, to really know truth, it means uniting with a person that we can't unite with pride and self-will.
And we unite to that person so that we become capable of acting like that person, so that we will also embody truth and love.
Yeah, we don't do that philosophically, right? By saying, okay, this person taught these philosophical things. It's not like Confucianism, right? This person taught these philosophical things, and I will live by these philosophical precepts. It is that being united with God, we really become like him. We acquire his mind so that we naturally think as he thinks. And this is what we see in in the lives of the saints. The saints are those who have been healed, who exude love, not as some kind of philosophical principle, and certainly not as some chemical reactions in the brain. The love that they're exuding, that they are experiencing, that they are expressing and extending to other people, it's uncreated. It's beyond human.
And it's not a guruism either, because we're not trying to emulate the saint. We're looking to the saint to know how to emulate Christ.
That's it.
They're emulating Christ, which gives us some concrete example of how we can also, but the goal is not to emulate the saint as such.
Right, we're on their path, and they have ended the path before we have, and they show us the fruit, and they show us the proof that it works. And this is the amazing thing. I mean, we have 2,000 years of theology, and our theology is not philosophy. And you read the saints throughout the generations, including those who've lived in the last century, and they have an identical theology. Their expression of who God is the same, whether they are one who reads theological books or they are literate, whether they're educated or not educated, because they know the same person. If, let's say, a child, two children, two sons know their father, and one has a degree from Oxford, and the other child never got a higher education, maybe even has a learning disability, and took a completely different path in life, their father is the same, right? Now, in a human perspective, there are two children can grow up in the same family, have an entirely different perspective of what's going on. So that breaks down sometimes. But let's say the two, sons, they know their father very well and have very similar experiences with their father. Then they know their father by knowledge. Those of us that are married, we know our spouses through personal knowledge, not by reading something. And that's our knowledge of God is in the same way. So the saints are those who have shown us the path. Those that we call the fathers, which includes the mothers of the church, they are teachers because they have experienced it, and they are those who, because of their experience, can teach us the path. And for 2,000 years, they're teaching the same path, really beyond 2,000 years. You read the ancient prophets, and it's the same thing because it's the same God. And this is not overturned by ideology, right? This is the thing about humanly derived ideology, is look at history. It is constantly being overturned by some other new ideology or recycling some old ideology again with some new flavor. But theology is not ideology. It comes not by human reasoning or by being a social construct. It comes by revelation. Within the church that God created himself, the West has been separated from that church for over 1,000 years. So it's not surprising that we are in this situation.
I have something I'd like to read that I think will help highlight this distinction we're trying to make between politics and ideology. This is a series of short quotes from a couple of saints that I'll name as I read. And I think these quotes will surprise people. They certainly surprised me when I read them. But I hope, and maybe you can help me unpack it, but I think this will help illustrate the distinction between supporting a political position versus remaining true to an ideology. The first quote is from Saint Sophrony of Essex, which he said in and around 1981. Communism is put into practice in the Holy Spirit. Without the Holy Spirit, it is an impossible ideal. This is clear in the case of Ananias and Sapphira. They wanted to keep some of their wealth for themselves, and the Apostle Peter told them, "You have not lied to men, but to God." And St. Paisius the Athonite, who lived a little sooner than St. Sophrony, but relatively modern, said, "Personally, if the communists weren't atheists, if they didn't hurt Christ, I would agree with them. It is good for the plots of land and the factories to belong to everyone. not for one to be hungry while someone else is throwing away food. If material goods are not distributed with the gospel, in the end, they will be distributed with a knife. And then also, relatively recently, Father John Romanides said, "Today, all the Marxists who live in Greece are empiricists. Of course, they do not realize this because Greek ideological Marxists are not familiar with the Marxist family tree as their counterparts in Europe and America are. Over here, they just mechanically memorize their lessons in Marxism as a Jehovah's Witness would. I think it is a real tragedy, and I am not talking about a tragedy of a cliquus, but about something shameful, that there are not any intellectually compelling Marxists in Greece. Of course, their absence is a windfall for the police and the political right and the modern Greek theologians, but it is a misfortune for the pursuit of the truth. Marxism started out with principles taken from experience and ended up where it ended up. From a scholarly point of view, Marxism and patristic theology share the same foundation, so that if Marxists and patristic theologians would come together, they would be able to communicate with each other. Although it is true that Marxism came into conflict with religion, we need to ask ourselves, with what kind of religion did it come into conflict? It did not come into conflict with revelation, but with religion that is identified with metaphysics. Adamantios Kourias belonged to that group of metaphysicists who made such an identification, identifying the destiny of Hellenism with metaphysics. I find that very powerful. I'm in no way, shape, or form interested in promoting or defending communism with or without atheism, but I feel like that helps us see the tension that in American politics we're not willing to embrace, we're not willing to wrestle with. We want a politics that always aligns with our ideology, rather than ever being willing to admit that there's something in a position we can't embrace that has some merit. Because what of it that does have merit, maybe that does align with our ideology, and that's why we can say it has some merit, and we can reject the rest. We're very uncomfortable with that here. And so I found that very fascinating. Particularly voices coming from a country that spent a long time wrestling with this very particular political question of communism in a very practical, day-to-day, revolutionary kind of way.
And the boldness of this statement, if we think about it, is from the fact that so many Orthodox Christians were martyred by communist regimes. And yet, Orthodoxy is not a competing ideology. Orthodoxy is a spiritual path that comes from revelation, and it is characterized by sobriety. And the Gospel of John is a text that I'm going to do a study of in my parish soon. And I did an advertisement for it, and I used an eagle as an animal symbol for St. John as an eagle, because he's shows us really the height of theology and helps us understand the height and the depth, if we read the other three Gospels, of what is going on, like the profound explanation of what is going on there. And Orthodoxy is sort of like that with the world. We have a God's eye perspective on everything.
Thank you for listening. This is where we will leave the conversation for now. Tune in 2 weeks for the second half of this conversation, and 2 weeks after that, and 2 weeks after that for the follow-on conversation, which is more or less on the same broad topic we have been discussing for some time now, which is the difficulty of incorporating the Orthodox way of the life of faithfulness into the two dominant Western ideologies. Again, thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Christian Saints podcast. We appreciate your attention. If this podcast has been edifying for you, please subscribe so we know you are listening, and share this program with someone who you believe will also enjoy it. Links to the entire Paradosis Pavilion catalog of educational programs, as well as the music of generative sounds, are available in the episode description. You can engage with us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, or Blue Sky to provide feedback, ask questions, make suggestions for future episodes, or just to say hello. We would love to hear from you. Please forgive us our shortcomings and pray for us.